They ordered him to undress right there in the palace courtyard, in front of a crowd of tourists recording from behind the gates. Stripped down and humiliated, he stood silently as they prepared to go further. But the moment they reached for his trousers, he spoke a single word, "No." Just then, the palace commander arrived, glanced at the tattoo etched along the guard's spine and froze in his tracks. What happened next left everyone stunned. Before we reveal how it all unfolded, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. And be sure to subscribe. We share stories like this every single day. Now, let's get into what really happened. The fog rolled across Buckingham Palace's ancient cobblestones like whispers of the past. And within that ethereal haze, hundreds of tourists gathered with anticipation dancing in their eyes. They arrived, seeking pageantry, tradition, and those iconic moments of British grandeur that would fill their social media feeds. None could have imagined they were about to witness an event that would expose secrets buried deeper than state archives. Standing motionless in his ceremonial position was Lance Sergeant Thomas Hartwell, a figure carved from discipline itself. At 29, his imposing frame of 6 feet and 3 inches was wrapped in the traditional scarlet wool that had adorned Queen's guards for generations. His eyes, the color of storm clouds over the North Sea, gazed forward with unwavering focus, acknowledging nothing while observing everything. The endless parade of pointing fingers, camera flashes, and whispered comments was merely background noise to a man who had learned to find stillness in chaos. From across the courtyard, Colonel Edmund Whitmore watched with predatory interest. At 55, Whitmore possessed the bearing of a man who had spent decades accumulating authority like a miser. Hoards gold, his chest bore enough ribbons and medals to outfit a small regiment, each one representing a step up the ladder of military hierarchy. Yet something about Hartwell's unshakable composure grated against Whitmore's sense of order. The young sergeant carried himself with a quiet dignity that felt almost insubordinate in its perfection. The scheduled inspection approached with the inevitability of sunrise, but there was nothing routine about the electricity crackling in the morning air. As Whitmore's polished boots echoed across the weathered stones, tourists instinctively stepped back, sensing the shift from ceremony to confrontation. Conversations faded to whispers, then to silence, as the crowd recognized they were about to witness something beyond their usual tourist experience. Whitmore positioned himself mere inches from Hartwell's face, close enough that their breath mingled in the cool air. The standoff stretched for endless moments. 2 men locked in a battle of wills that neither fully understood. The colonel began his methodical examination, scrutinizing every thread, every button, every microscopic detail with the intensity of a man searching for justification rather than flaws. Lance Sergeant Hartwell. Whitmore's voice sliced through the morning silence with surgical precision, each word weighted with decades of command authority. "Present yourself for inspection." Hartwell's response was a masterpiece of military bearing. 3 crisp steps forward, boots striking stone with rhythmic precision, posture unchanged, eyes still fixed on infinity. Yet those who studied his face might have detected the subtle tightening around his mouth, the barely perceptible shift that suggested deep waters beneath a calm surface. The examination commenced with all the formality of a religious ritual. Whitmore dissected every aspect of Hartwell's appearance with microscopic attention, searching for the smallest deviation from perfection. The uniform's brass gleamed like liquid gold, the boots reflected the morning sky, and every crease fell with mathematical precision. Yet Whitmore's growing frustration was palpable. He was hunting imperfection with the desperation of a man whose pride depended on finding it. Time crawled forward with agonizing slowness. The crowd shifted restlessly, sensing the undercurrent of hostility, but unable to comprehend its source. Children tugged at their parents' clothing, asking innocent questions about why the fancy soldier looked so angry. Parents hushed them, nervously, their instincts warning them that something was terribly wrong. Whitmore's examination grew increasingly invasive, his white-gloved hands probing for flaws that existed only in his imagination. He checked belt buckles with obsessive precision, examined stitching with a jeweler's loupe, and scrutinized every surface for signs of imperfection. The crowd watched in uncomfortable silence as military discipline transformed into something that felt more like persecution. Then Whitmore discovered his prize, a nearly invisible mark on Hartwell's collar, so minuscule that it could only be seen from certain angles and specific lighting. It might have been a speck of dust, a microscopic fiber, or simply a shadow, but in that moment, it became Whitmore's weapon of choice. "Unacceptable uniform standards," Whitmore announced with theatrical volume. ensuring his words carried to every corner of the courtyard. His voice dripped with the satisfaction of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey. "This level of negligence is a disgrace to Her Majesty's service." The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Several tourists exchanged uncomfortable glances, their sense of British fair play offended by what they were witnessing. A small girl asked her grandfather why the mean man was shouting at the nice soldier, and the old man's weathered face darkened with disapproval he couldn't voice. Hartwell remained a statue of composure, his breathing steady and controlled. This absolute stillness seemed to infuriate Whitmore further. He had expected submission, perhaps fear, certainly some crack in that maddening facade of professional calm. Instead, he faced a wall of disciplined silence that mocked his authority and challenged his power. "Are you deaf, Lance Sergeant?" Whitmore's voice climbed toward hysteria, his face flushing crimson beneath his peaked cap. "I've identified serious deficiencies in your appearance. What's your response?" Military protocol demanded acknowledgement, apology, and promises of improvement. But Hartwell offered nothing. No words, no gesture, no sign that he had even heard the accusations. His silence became a form of resistance that drove Whitmore to the edge of rational thought. And that's when the colonel crossed a line that would destroy everything. "Remove it," Whitmore commanded, his voice cutting through the morning like a blade through silk. "Strip off that tunic, immediately." The words struck the assembled crowd like lightning. Gasps rippled through the tourists as phones materialized. In trembling hands, instinctively documenting what promised to be either a scandal or a tragedy, an elderly woman physically turned away, while a veteran in the crowd straightened his shoulders with barely controlled anger. For the first time since the confrontation began, Hartwell's eyes moved. The shift was barely perceptible, just the slightest adjustment of focus. But when his gaze met Whitmore's, something passed between them, a wordless communication that drained color from the colonel's face. Before his rage reasserted control, "You heard the order," Whitmore repeated, his voice now carrying an edge of desperation that hadn't existed moments before. He was trapped by his own public challenge, unable to retreat without devastating loss of face. "Remove your tunic or face court-martial for insubordination." The crowd murmured with increasing unease. What had begun as military discipline had descended into public humiliation, and many spectators began lowering their cameras, suddenly reluctant to document what felt like a man's deliberate destruction. Others continued, recording, drawn by the same morbid fascination that causes traffic to slow at accident scenes. Hartwell's hands rose to his collar with the mechanical precision of a soldier. Following orders he found distasteful, but would not resist. The first button released with a whisper of fabric against fabric, then the second. Each movement was deliberate, professional, controlled, as if he were performing a ceremonial drill. Rather than submitting to public degradation, the scarlet tunic slipped away, revealing the pristine white dress shirt beneath. But this wasn't sufficient for Whitmore, whose eyes now blazed with cruel satisfaction that made several onlookers physically ill. He was feeding on the power to reduce a proud man to an object of mockery, and he wanted more, all of it. "Whitmore," hissed, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried across the silent courtyard. "Every piece." That's when Colonel Marcus Sterling, approaching from the palace's east wing, broke into a sprint. Sterling was a soldier's soldier with 3 decades of combat experience, a man who had served in 5 conflicts and understood the difference between discipline and cruelty. What he was witnessing fell squarely into the latter category, but Sterling was still 40 yards away when Hartwell began unbuttoning his dress shirt. The morning breeze touched Hartwell's skin as the white cotton slipped from his shoulders. The crowd's collective intake of breath sounded like wind through a graveyard, because there, etched across the canvas of Hartwell's back in ink so black it seemed to absorb light itself, was a tapestry of secrets that no civilian was ever meant to witness. The centerpiece dominated his spine, a serpent coiled in perfect spirals, every scale rendered with photographic detail that made the creature appear to writhe in the shifting light. Through the snake's head, a sword thrust skyward, its blade gleaming with artistic highlights that gave the weapon dimension and menace. Below this dramatic imagery, Latin words flowed in elegant script, virtues et honor, virtue and honor. But the true revelation lay in the surrounding details. Numbers covered every available inch of skin, coordinates precise to the second, dates that corresponded to newspaper headlines about unexplained international incidents, reference codes that meant nothing to civilians but everything to those who understood their significance. Along his left shoulder blade, rows of small marks resembled tallies, dozens of them arranged with military precision. Whitmore stared at the tattoo with the expression of a man who had opened a door expecting to find a closet and instead discovered an abyss. His mouth worked soundlessly, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and finally absolute terror. Because Colonel Edmund Whitmore, despite his impressive collection of medals and political connections, had never operated in the shadows, where nations send their most expendable assets to handle their most unforgivable business. But he had heard whispers in officer clubs, rumors spoken in hushed tones about units that existed outside official records, about soldiers who vanished from all documentation after completing missions that would never be acknowledged. The serpent tattoo wasn't mere decoration, it was a memorial wall, a graveyard written in flesh. Those coordinates marking Hartwell's skin weren't random numbers. They identified mass burial sites and locations that appeared on no tourist maps, places where the dark work of nations left its permanent scars. Colonel Sterling reached the scene just as Whitmore stumbled backward, his face the color of old paper. Sterling absorbed the situation in a single glance and immediately grasped the catastrophic nature of what had just occurred. His voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of a man who had earned his rank through blood rather than politics. "Colonel, cease and desist immediately." The command echoed across the courtyard with enough force to make pigeons take flight. But Whitmore seemed beyond hearing, his eyes still locked on the tattoo that had just shattered his understanding of the man he thought he was humiliating. The silence following Sterling's command stretched across the courtyard like a held breath. Even London's constant background noise seemed muted, as if the city itself sensed the gravity of what was unfolding. Hartwell stood perfectly, motionless, his back a manuscript of secrets written in permanent ink, while the world around him struggled to comprehend what it was seeing. A grizzled man in the crowd, wearing a Royal Navy veteran's pin on his civilian jacket, suddenly snapped to attention. His weathered hands shook as he raised them in salute, tears cutting tracks down his scarred cheeks. He couldn't decipher the specific meaning of the tattoo, but he recognized the bearing of a warrior who had sacrificed everything for Queen and country. Gradually, other veterans in the crowd followed his example, creating a spontaneous honor guard of recognition amid what had been intended as public shame. Sterling moved with the swift efficiency of a crisis management expert. He seized Whitmore by the elbow, his grip firm enough to bruise, and dragged him away from the crowd. Their conversation was conducted in urgent whispers, but their body language told the complete story. Sterling's controlled fury contrasting sharply with Whitmore's mounting panic. "That soldier," Sterling hissed into Whitmore's ear, "has more classified missions in his file than you have years of service. His psychological evaluation is classified at levels, requiring prime ministerial approval to access. If his identity is compromised, if this incident leaks, people will die, and you, Colonel, will be held personally responsible." Whitmore's throat worked soundlessly, his mind reeling from the implications of Sterling's words. The colonel had built his career on intimidation and bureaucratic maneuvering, but he suddenly faced consequences that existed far beyond the comfortable world of military politics. Meanwhile, Hartwell remained absolutely still, neither ashamed nor defiant. His breathing stayed controlled, his posture unchanged from when he had first assumed his post hours earlier. The tattoo on his back revealed its secrets to anyone with eyes to see, but Hartwell himself offered no explanations, no justifications, no acknowledgement of the chaos swirling around him. A teenage girl in the crowd, obviously American by her accent, whispered urgently to her companion, "What do those symbols mean?" Her friend, a British exchange student, shook his head slowly. "I don't think we're meant to understand," he replied, and something in his tone suggested he was beginning to grasp the true magnitude of what they were witnessing. The morning sun had climbed higher during the confrontation, burning away the mist that had initially shrouded the palace grounds. In the clear light, additional details of Hartwell's tattoo became visible. Military unit insignias that didn't match any official records, dates that aligned with international incidents that had never been satisfactorily explained in press reports, and most disturbing of all, a series of names inscribed in script so minute it was barely legible, except to anyone standing directly behind him. Sterling concluded his urgent conference with Whitmore and approached Hartwell with the careful respect one might show an unexploded mine. The colonel had served long enough to recognize the type of man who carried his wars beneath his skin, and he knew such men weren't created by accident or broken by ceremony. "Lance Sergeant," Sterling said quietly, his voice pitched just loud enough for Hartwell to hear. "You are dismissed to dress." For the first time since the ordeal began, Hartwell moved. Not hurriedly, not with relief or vindication, but with the same methodical precision that had characterized his undressing. He bent to retrieve his shirt, and as he did, the crowd glimpsed his chest, another landscape of ink. Though only partially visible from their angle, what they could observe suggested that the back tattoo was merely one chapter in a much more extensive narrative, a story written in permanent ink across a man's body, each mark representing a waypoint on a journey through territories that existed in the shadows between nations. As Hartwell drew the white dress shirt over his shoulders and began securing the buttons, something extraordinary happened. The crowd began applauding. It started with the elderly naval veteran who had first saluted, a slow, measured clapping that spoke of respect rather than entertainment. Others joined, not everyone, and not enthusiastically, but with the kind of recognition that emerges when people realize they have witnessed something far more profound than they initially understood. Whitmore observed this spontaneous tribute with growing horror. What had begun as a simple assertion of authority had transformed into something resembling a celebration of the man he had attempted to humiliate. The colonel could visualize his career evaporating, could already imagine the headlines, the investigations, the quiet conversations in secure rooms that would determine his fate. Sterling produced his mobile phone and began making calls, not to journalists, to prevent journalists. His voice was urgent, but controlled as he contacted various government departments, activating protocols that most citizens didn't know existed. Within minutes, security personnel in civilian clothing began materializing at the crowd's periphery, politely encouraging tourists to delete their photos and videos, offering alternative palace tours that would lead them away from this particular courtyard. But their efforts came too late. In the digital age, information spreads faster than official responses. Videos had already been uploaded, images shared, hashtags trending. The picture of the tattooed guard was propagating across the internet like wildfire, and no amount of official pressure could completely contain it. Hartwell completed his dressing with the same ceremony he had undressed, every button secured with military precision, every fold smoothed with professional care. When fully clothed again, he returned to his position without a word, resuming the motionless stance that had defined his morning. But the atmosphere had changed. The remaining tourists regarded him differently now, with a mixture of awe and uncertainty that hadn't existed before. The immediate aftermath unfolded like a precisely choreographed ballet of damage control. Sterling coordinated with palace security to manage the crowd, while Whitmore found himself effectively neutralized, his authority dissolved by the magnitude of his miscalculation. The colonel stood isolated, his face ashen and drawn, watching his military career disintegrate in real time. A black limousine materialized at the palace gates, with suspicious promptness, suggesting official involvement. At the highest levels, 3 individuals in bespoke suits emerged, their demeanor and bearing identifying them as government operatives rather than palace staff. They approached Sterling with urgent whispers and meaningful gestures, clearly briefing him on developments occurring far above the clearance level of anyone in uniform. Within 2 hours, the official narrative began crystallizing. A psychological resilience evaluation had been conducted to test the Queen's Guard. Under extraordinary circumstances, the supervising officer had exceeded his authority and would face appropriate disciplinary measures. The guard in question had performed admirably under exceptional pressure and would receive recognition for his professionalism. It was a masterwork of institutional fiction, crafted with the expertise that comes from decades of managing inconvenient truths. The story was distributed through official channels, embraced by cooperative media outlets, and gradually began supplanting the more sensational accounts that had initially emerged from eyewitness reports. But for those who had been present, who had seen Hartwell's tattoo in all its terrible detail, the official explanation rang hollow. They had witnessed something that transcended military discipline or training exercises. They had glimpsed a reality that existed in the spaces between what governments acknowledged and what they actually authorized to protect their citizens. Hartwell himself remained at his post throughout this orchestrated confusion, an island of stability in a world suddenly gone mad around him. Tourists still approached, still photographed, but their behavior had shifted. Where previously they had treated him as a curiosity, now they maintained respectful distance. Children who might have once tried to provoke reactions now stayed close to their guardians, sensing something in his stillness that discouraged casual interaction. As the afternoon progressed, a steady stream of military personnel began appearing at the palace. Not ceremonial guards or administrative staff who normally populated such spaces, but men and women with the lean, alert appearance of active operators. They arrived individually or in small groups, never announcing their purpose, simply taking up observation positions around the courtyard. These were Hartwell's Brotherhood, not his current unit, but the shadows he had emerged from. Word had traveled through channels that didn't appear on organizational charts, carried by individuals who understood the significance of what had transpired. They came to bear witness, to ensure that one of their own wasn't left to face the consequences in isolation. The changing of the guard occurred at precisely 1600 hours, as it had every day for centuries, but today, the ceremony carried additional weight that was felt by everyone present. When Hartwell's replacement approached, a young private fresh from training, the contrast between the two men was striking. Where Hartwell carried himself with the controlled stillness of a weapon at rest, the private displayed the rigid tension of someone terrified of making mistakes. As Hartwell stepped away from his post, the private whispered something, just a few words, barely audible to anyone more than an arm's length away. But Hartwell's response, a slight nod and the briefest contact of his hand with the younger man's shoulder, conveyed recognition that transcended rank or protocol. It was the acknowledgement of one warrior by another, a transfer of responsibility that had nothing to do with ceremonial duty, and everything to do with the kind of trust earned in places where trust means survival. Sterling appeared at Hartwell's side as he departed the palace, falling into step with the easy familiarity of men who had served together in darker places than this. Their conversation was quiet, conducted in the military shorthand that conveyed maximum information with minimum words. "Transportation is arranged," Sterling murmured. "Secure facility has been prepared. New documentation will be ready within 36 hours. Hartwell nodded without breaking stride. This was the protocol they had both hoped would never be necessary. The contingency plan that existed for exactly this kind of exposure. Within a week, Lance Sergeant Thomas Hartwell would officially perish in a training accident. Within a month, a man with different credentials and a carefully constructed background would appear elsewhere entirely, carrying the same capabilities, but none of the visible reminders of how he had acquired them. The black limousine waited just beyond the palace grounds, engine running and rear door already open. As Hartwell approached the vehicle, he paused momentarily and glanced back at the palace, at the tourists still congregating in the courtyard, at the young private now standing rigid at his former post. For just an instant, something flickered across his features, not regret, precisely, but a kind of weary acknowledgement that another chapter of his existence was concluding. The tattoo on his back would need modification or concealment, the coordinates and names obscured by new artwork that would hide the truth. Beneath layers of misdirection, it was a small death, the erasure of memories that had been literally inscribed in his flesh. But as he settled into the limousine's leather interior, Hartwell's expression returned to its characteristic neutrality. He was a man trained to adapt, to survive, to vanish when circumstances demanded it. The humiliation he had endured that morning was already becoming just another memory to be catalogued, another experience to be learned from and then forgotten. The limousine pulled away from the curb with the smooth efficiency of a vehicle belonging to people who valued discretion above comfort. Within moments, it had disappeared into London's afternoon traffic, carrying its passenger toward a future that would be constructed on the careful destruction of his past. The reverberations of that morning's incident continued spreading through channels both official and clandestine. In a windowless conference room buried deep beneath Thames House, individuals with titles that appeared in no public directory assembled to assess the damage and coordinate their response. The meeting was off the record, as was the unit they were discussing, as were the operations that had necessitated the unit's existence in the first place. The woman presiding over the meeting appeared to be in her late 40s, with the kind of forgettable appearance that made her invisible in crowds, an essential skill in her profession. She had been managing assets like Hartwell for over 15 years, guiding them through missions that would never be acknowledged and helping them disappear when their utility was exhausted. Asset Serpent 9 has been compromised, she announced. Without preamble, facial recognition algorithms have already identified him in 8 different international databases. His operational identity is blown, and by extension, so are the missions he participated in. Around the conference table, her colleagues processed this information with the professional detachment of people who traded in Human lives as commodities. They were already calculating broader implications, identifying which operations would need termination, which assets would require relocation, which allies would need briefing on the security breach. What about the officer who caused the exposure? Inquired a man with the refined accent of someone educated at institutions that didn't advertise their existence. Colonel Whitmore. According to our files, he's being managed, the woman replied. Career termination, followed by assignment to a position where his knowledge of this incident becomes irrelevant. He'll complete his service counting inventory in some remote supply depot, assuming he survives the psychological pressure of understanding what he's cost his nation. The discussion that followed was conducted in the cool, analytical language of professionals addressing a business problem, rather than the destruction of human lives. They spoke of asset management and operational security and acceptable casualties, carefully avoiding terminology that might remind them of the human cost of their decisions. Meanwhile, in a safe house located in an unremarkable residential area 50 minutes outside London, Hartwell sat motionless while a man with surgeon's precision worked on his back. The process of modifying the tattoo was meticulous, requiring careful application of new ink over old to obscure the coordinates and names, while preserving the artistic integrity of the original design. The work would require multiple sessions, each carefully spaced to allow healing. When complete, the serpent would remain, but the map of graves would be gone, replaced by decorative elements that would satisfy casual observers, without revealing the truth to those trained to read the signs. This will be uncomfortable, the artist warned, preparing his equipment with the methodical care of someone who understood that perfection was required on the first attempt. Hartwell's response was barely perceptible, the slightest shrug from a man for whom physical discomfort had long since ceased to be meaningful. He had endured worse than needles in service of his country, had carried burdens heavier than the secrets on his back. A few hours of deliberate pain seemed insignificant payment for the opportunity to disappear once more into the shadows where he belonged. As the needle began its work, Hartwell closed his eyes and allowed his mind to drift back to the morning's events. He found himself thinking not about Whitmore or Sterling, or the political machinations that were even now reshaping his future, but about the young private who had assumed his place at the palace. 6 months later, Private Richardson stood at the same post where Hartwell had once maintained his vigil. The young soldier had evolved into the role, his initial anxiety replaced by the kind of steady confidence that emerges from mastery through repetition. Tourists still photographed him, children still attempted to provoke reactions, and he endured it all with the professional patience that had become instinctive. But sometimes, during the quiet hours when the palace grounds emptied, and his shift neared its end, Richardson would remember the morning he had witnessed a man's destruction and rebirth. He never spoke of what he had observed. Military discipline and official warnings had guaranteed his silence, but the memory remained vivid in his mind like frames from a half-forgotten film. The official narrative had succeeded in its purpose. The incident was remembered, when remembered at all, as a training exercise that had exceeded its parameters. Colonel Whitmore had been quietly reassigned to an administrative position in the Outer Hebrides, his rapid departure explained by the military's need for experienced officers in isolated postings. The videos that had briefly circulated online had been overwhelmed by more current scandals, and forgotten by all except the most dedicated conspiracy researchers. Yet in certain communities, the story endured. Veterans would occasionally reference it in hushed conversations, sharing details that had never appeared in official reports. They discussed the tattoo, the coordinates and names that had been visible for mere moments before being concealed again. They speculated about what kind of service would mark a man in such a way, what kind of missions would require such permanent reminders of temporary victories. A handful of particularly determined investigators had attempted to decode the coordinates. They claimed to remember, plotting them on maps and trying to correlate them with unexplained incidents in the indicated locations, but their efforts were frustrated by the sheer impossibility of their task. The coordinates had been visible for minutes, captured in unsteady phone videos that had been deleted almost as quickly as they were posted. The man himself had vanished, as completely as if he had never existed. Thomas Hartwell's military records documented a training accident that had occurred 6 days after the palace incident, a routine exercise gone wrong that had claimed the life of a promising young soldier. The funeral had been private, attended only by military personnel who maintained their silence with the discipline of professionals who understood the price of careless words. But in a quiet pub in Glasgow, a man who might have been Hartwell occasionally appeared for a solitary drink and a game of billiards. He called himself David Mitchell now, claimed to work in corporate security for multinational firms, and displayed the kind of unobtrusive competence that made him instantly forgettable. To casual acquaintances, his back, when glimpsed through an accidentally opened shirt, revealed the artistic remnants of a tattoo that might once have told a very different story. The serpent remained, coiled and menacing, but the sword now appeared to emerge from stylized waves rather than piercing. A skull. The Latin inscription was unchanged, virtues et honor, but the coordinates and names had been replaced by Celtic knotwork that enhanced the tattoo's visual appeal, while revealing nothing of its original significance. Occasionally, when evening conversations in the pub turned to the philosophical topics that emerge from the depths of whiskey glasses, someone would inquire about David Mitchell's tattoo. His response was invariably the same: a slight smile and a redirection of conversation that discouraged further questions. Without seeming discourteous, the secret remained buried, as such secrets always did, in the gap between what people knew and what they were permitted to understand. The palace guards continued their ancient ritual. Tourists continued to observe and photograph, and the machinery of government continued operating with the smooth efficiency of an organization that had learned to manage its contradictions. And, in the shadows where such men belonged, the work continued, invisible, unacknowledged, and absolutely essential for preserving a world that could afford to remain ignorant of the prices paid for its security. The serpent might have changed its skin, but it had not forgotten how to strike when circumstances demanded it. The story concluded where it had begun, with silence and duty, and the kind of sacrifice that could never be properly honored because it could never be properly acknowledged. In the end, that was sufficient. It had to be.